Hello, how are you? Good? Okay, but how are you? A question which perhaps you'll find a little bit harder to answer. But if I asked you what you're wearing, what your parents do for a living, what you like to do in your spare time, what you like to eat, and where you go on holiday, you'll probably find those kinds of questions much more straightforward to answer. We are going to explore how these choices, so your personal taste and preferences, are shaped by social class. So, in this session, we're going to be looking at identity through the lens of social class. But what is social class? So, humans organise social life. They organise and distribute power and wealth. How that power and wealth is distributed amongst people has not tended towards equality. Instead, distribution of wealth and power, or capital, has produced a class system. And how that class system is produced and reproduced changes across time and place, but profoundly impacts on people's lives and identities. So, the Industrial Revolution has been accredited with creating a class system which would define the modern Western world. Industrialization required cheap and unskilled labour as the machines replacing the skilled labour of craft people. It also created a growing middle class, the bourgeoisie of professionals to manage this labour. And their wives and daughters consumed their outputs and dressed to affirm their own leisured status and the wealth of their husbands and fathers. So the upper class and aristocracy were forced to relinquish some of their absolute power to appease the growing bourgeoisie in the 19th century. But this three-tier system of working class, middle, and upper class has really defined the Western world for much of the 19th and 20th centuries. So, George Simmel proposed in an article first published in 1904 a theory of fashion based on class differentiation. So, according to Simmel, the mechanism of changing fashion has to do with the need of the elite to distinguish their status from the lower classes. The immediately lower classes, so i.e. the middle class, will seek to emulate the upper classes by adopting their new fashions, whereupon the elite will discard it in favour of a new style to maintain their distinction, or to use Simmel's term, prestige. So this theory is often referred to as the trickle-down theory of fashion, where the lower classes emulate the upper classes. And if you were studying fashion at the beginning of the 19th century, it is, or beginning of the 20th century, it's not a surprising conclusion to reach. But as the 20th century progressed, those who studied fashion realised that the mechanisms for change in fashion were somewhat more complicated. And one of the first theories to pose an alternative perspective to Simmel was Herbert Blumer. And he argued that rather than fashion becoming fashion because it's been adopted by the elite, it is, in a sense, the other way around. The elite becomes fashionable because they have attached themselves to a particular style. And this means that fashion is less a product of antagonism or opposition between the classes, but that any styles, as long as they're deemed desirable and new, regardless of their origin, can instigate fashionable change. So, as an example, Princess Diana was a fashion icon because of her ability to discern what to wear and when. It was her fashion sensibility which afforded her status as a fashion trendsetter, not her royal status per se. When we're in a few weeks' time, we're going to explore subcultural style identities. We're going to see a bit more of the impact made of non-elite streetwear on fashion. But I thought Coco Chanel is an interesting example to explore in terms of class for a range of reasons. So Chanel was from a very humble working class background, but rose to establish one of the most successful elite fashion houses of the 20th century. And in her early days, Chanel quarried working class styles to present elite women with a look which was entirely modern. Using simple and humble fabrics such as jersey and a lean silhouette to create a minimalist yet luxurious and sophisticated style. Yet throughout her life, she was extremely secretive about her working class background and renowned for her snobbish and anti Semitic attitudes. She mixed with aristocracy, with confidence, and a clothing where, even by French couture standards, extraordinarily expensive. Coco Chanel transcended her class background and was highly influential in setting the direction for elite women's fashion in the 20th century. So during the 1960s, every respectable woman, I'm exaggerating obviously, but including my own working class grandmother, owned a Chanel inspired, if not the real thing, boucle skirt suit, collarless with gold, silver, or brass buttons, and a contrast rim around the neckline and button stand. An absolute classic. So what Chanel had was taste, a type of sensibility difficult to put your finger on. Particularly in her case, when it was also combined with an instinct for newness and innovation. Someone who has tried to put his finger on this concept of taste is French theorist Pierre Bourdieu in his seminal book Distinction. So we usually think of taste as something we just have. We may acknowledge that has it been influenced by others, but for most part we think of taste as something personal and something we've chosen freely, or sometimes as well in a kind of natural proclivity. Bourdieu shows us that it is just not so simple. To explain how culture happens, Bourdieu uses the concept of a field, and he defines a field as a structured space of positions and forces which are relational and work as a kind of microcosm of mutually influencing forces, as well as practices and agents who operate within it. And some of those forces work to maintain the status quo and others to reform the field. And at some historical moments, these fields can seem very stable, whereas other times they are in flux. So I think, for example, the time we're living in now is one example of the latter, that we're living in this time of change and instability in the field of the fashion industry. So we can think of the fashion industry in 1920s or 1910s France, when Chanel established herself as one such field. And indeed, Bourdieu defined haute couture as a subfield of the field of fashion industry at large. So in this field, he argued, established couture houses exerted their cultural influence and power via the mechanism of capital. But by capital, it doesn't mean simply money. Bourdieu makes a distinction between economic, social, symbolic, and cultural capital. So here, economic capital refers to one's financial assets, social capital to one's contacts and network, symbolic capital to the status that these hold, and cultural capital to the perceived value of the embodied or objectified resources that someone controls or can mobilize. So whereas the fashion industry at large would have to consider things like profitability, couture is elevated by nature of its cultural and symbolic capital to a sphere which does not concern itself with such vulgar things as money. Instead, couture is allowed to pursue artistic and creative freedom, and attention to craftsmanship and detail, which means that currently a Chanel couture gown would start at about £30,000 to £40,000. If you have to ask how much it is, you just can't afford it. Okay, but let's return to the early 20th century again. So the catastrophic effects of World War I meant that some of the old social structures were disrupted, allowing for entry into elite society of persons who may not previously have been welcomed. So, for example, when Charles Frederick Worth established the first couture house in Paris in the mid-19th century, he dressed royalty and the aristocracy, but himself did not gain access into these spheres as an individual. Where some decades later, Coco Chanel did exactly that. So she was not simply dressing the elite, she was able to join them as a legitimate player, or an agent, as Bourdieu would put it. How did that happen? Coco Chanel did not initially possess the economic capital necessary to establish a fashion business, because in order for a fashion business to pretend that money doesn't matter, you really have to have lots of it. And in order to make headway into the field of fashion, Chanel had to deploy strategies of innovation and subversion to construct symbolic and cultural capital and then convert this into economic capital. So Coco Chanel was strategic in two ways. So firstly, how she embodied a new fashionable identity at the time of cultural and social upheaval, and how she presented her clients with the products which objectified this symbolic capital. So she was able to capitalize on her ability to forge social connections, so social capital, via her romantic relationships as well as friendships, and to accurately articulate and present a look which responded to the changing gender and class dynamics at the beginning of the 20th century. So a second concept of Bourdieu's, which is notoriously challenging to grasp, is the notion of habitus. So habitus is a part of our identity which we cannot escape, defined by Bourdieu as the systems of durable, transposable dispositions and a socially constituted system of cognitive and motivating structures. So let's unpack it a little bit. So your habitus is durable in that they last throughout your life, and transposable in that they are transported from one setting to another. So we take our habitus with us throughout our lives and into the different settings we find ourselves in. So, for example, the participants in the Paris is Burning documentary were doomed to perform white rich girl or executive in the context of the ballroom, as their identities they were mimicking were as inaccessible to them as the journey to Mars. But based on extensive research project into the taste of the French population during the 1960s, Bourdieu argued that taste is governed by social class. So tell us what music you listen to, what you do in your spare time, what you like to eat and how you dress, and he would able to determine your class and thereby your access to cultural, social, symbolic and economic capital. So the part of his argument is that we are each a product of our habitus. It is inescapable, but also invisible to us. We feel that our taste, values and preferences are our own, but really they are the product of the social, cultural and economic structures within which we are embedded. And habitus also involves the bodily dispositions which appear natural but are actually social. So for example, how we walk, talk, gesture, eat, sit, etc. are all a result of our habitus. And then also that our habitus is internalized. And this is why we get this phenomenon of internalized racism or internalized homophobia, for example, but also why we can be ignorant of our own privilege. So, for example, I have a PhD because I am academic, but I also have a PhD because my habitus values academic ability, and my parents were able to support my education emotionally, financially, and academically. So how much was it my personal talents and how much was it conditioned by my habitus? So do you remember this slide? So what sort of wedding dress you wear is therefore a product of your habitus. In his writing on the field of fashion in the 1970s, Bourdieu argues that what enabled a new designer like Courrèges to enter the field of fashion was his alignment to the habitus of the new and modern French bourgeoisie, whereas the established couture houses, such as Dior and Givenchy, were catering for the old guard of the European upper classes. Interestingly, Bourdieu does actually refer to Chanel in the 1970s, where her label had transitioned from new and innovative to classic, merely creating variations on a theme as the validity of her clothes were based on an affirmation of symbolic capital and the verification of her legitimacy in the field of fashion. She had transitioned in the field of fashion from a rebel to a conservative. But what is the current relationship between social class, identity, and fashion? Does your social class impact on what you wear? It can sometimes feel like everybody shops in Zara and that class identity is less important than it once was for how we dress. And certainly, Simmel's proposition that fashion is inherently about the elite seeking to distinguish themselves from the lower classes just doesn't quite add up. Here's, for example, Jeremy Scott, the creative director of the Italian fashion brand Moschino, with two models wearing what appears to be a hybrid of classic Chanel blended with the brand identity of McDonald's. So, elite and working class references in perfect harmony? I don't know. What's going on here? Is it postmodern irony? And here's probably an even more extreme example. Vetements doing DHL. So no attempt here at creating a kind of hybrid version. It's just a yellow DHL t-shirt from the 2016 Spring-Summer collection, now selling at Depop for £450. So fashion is increasingly being criticised for its appropriation of cultural and economic symbols. DHL delivery drivers are the factory workers of today, low paid, low status, with little or no prospect of career advancement. People clearly don't buy the DHL Vetements t-shirts because they want people to think they are delivery drivers. Instead, I suspect they buy the DHL t-shirts because it is the ultimate status symbol in terms of dress. To never have to worry about being one, I mean a delivery driver. So worn with a kind of nonchalance, it is an ultimate example of fashion harnessing its capital for all it's worth, cultural, symbolic, and economic. So let's return to our initial question. How did you become you? How did you come to make the choices you made? What other options were available to you? How did you come to dress the way you do? What options are available to you? The answer to all these questions, argues Bourdieu, rests within your habitus. But just as we can see how the power of capital, be it cultural, symbolic, social, or economic, will significantly shape your future career in the fashion industry, we can also be reminded of those who are able to transcend their initial lack of capital with an ability to harness their creativity and forge a career, often within the blind spots of the established field of fashion. Coco Chanel, Vivienne Westwood, Alexander McQueen are just some of these names.